All right, in chapter 8, we're going to continue our look as children of as victims by looking at school violence. And we tend to think about when we think about school violence, we tend to just think about school shootings, which of course is absolutely part of the victimization that children can experience. But there's all kinds of other victimization that can take place on school grounds as well. So when it comes to the scope of the problem, when we look at statistics here in the United States, statistics are compiled by a variety of sources, including the National Center for Education Statistics, Department of Education Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the National Crime Victim Survey, we've talked about that, and annual reports that are produced by the National Center for Educational Statistics. So here are some of the statistics. 6% of students in grades 9 through 12, so those are high school, are injured with a weapon on school property. 23% of students in high school have been injured in a physical fight. Students between the ages of 12 and 18, so now we're talking about middle school and high school, were victims of about 841,000 non-fatal crimes at school. 65% of public schools recorded one or more incidents of crime, amounting to an estimated 757,000 crimes that take place on school property. Of the 48 student, staff, and non-student violent deaths on school property that happened between 2008 and 2009, 26 were homicides, 20 were suicides. 3% of students in middle and high school reported they were afraid of attack at home or school. So you can see that this is a pretty serious problem for not only students, but teachers as well. And again, that does include things like school shooting, which which tend to get a lot of media attention. Another really big problem on schools and off school property, by the way, is bullying. We're all probably familiar with bullying. It is, really terrorizing somebody psychologically. It can include physically as well. And it can have devastating effects, even suicides in some cases. In 2015, the National Center for Education Statistics reported that 21% of students in middle and high school identified that they were bullied in the past year. Statistically speaking, middle school tends to be the highest grades for the number of bullying incidents, and the vast majority of bullying incidents, at least physical face-to-face bullying incidents, take place in school cafeterias, where kids are together with each other without a lot of supervision. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, in a large survey that was done, reported that found that more than 15,000 students reported bullying, being the victims of bullying at some point. 30% reported moderate to frequent involvement with bullying. 13% indicated they were bullies, and 10% indicated that they were victims. So there are a lot of kids that are involved with bullying in some form. Of those who were bullied, 12% were ridiculed, 18% were the subject of rumors, 5% were physically bullied, and 4% were threatened. And when it comes to the type of bullying, physical bullying is kind of what we think about when we think about bullying. It can include hitting, pushing, tripping, spitting, physical beatings, any type of physical contact between the bully and a victim. And again, the peak here is the middle school years and is reported twice as often by boys than by girls. So boys are reporting more physical bullying than girls are. Verbal bullying includes taunts, threats, name calling, derogatory comments. Twice as many students indicate they were victims of verbal bullying than those who admit to perpetrating it. Social bullying, rumors, behaviors aimed at deliberate social exclusion, and this type of bullying is more commonly reported by girls than it is by boys. So we have more physical bullying by boys and more, boys are more often victims of physical bullying, and girls are more often the victims of some type of social bullying. We also have internet-based bullying called cyberbullying, which we'll talk about in a minute, and that has really become prevalent in our culture. Now, some of the factors that contribute to bullying, it's not just one cause. There's not just one motivation. Again, humans are so complicated that there are a lot of different motivations. But here are some factors that could contribute to bullying behavior. The rate of family violence among bullied students is higher than among students who admit to being bullies. High self-esteem students are less likely to bully. So those with low self-esteem are more likely to be bullies. High self-esteem students are more likely to bully in negative school environments, and bullying is often perpetrated by someone the victim believes to be a friend. Now that brings us to cyberbullying. So this is one that has really been something we've focused on in terms of research and school prevention programs in the last 10, 15, 20 years. Cyberbullying can include things like email, text. It can also include things like posting on social media, creating false accounts on social media. So there's a lot of different ways that cyberbullying can take place. One of the interesting things about cyberbullying is that it allows people a sense of anonymity. You can create, fake profiles. You can use apps on your phone that will, create a fake phone number or block your phone number, so you can text with impunity and with anonymity, which makes it a little bit more insidious, because people that might not normally have the chutzpah to bully in a face-to-face setting can now use cyberbullying, with, kind of hiding behind profiles. And it just increases the number of bullying incidents that take place. So cyberbullying is any aggression that's intentionally repeated, carried out in some kind of electronic context, like I was just talking about. This is kind of a new area of growth for aggressive behavior because of that anonymity. Shares many common adverse effects with traditional bullying, so it can have just as much of an impact on victims. There have been, in the last 10 years, if you do an internet search on cyberbullying, you can find a lot of cases where victims have committed suicide or attempted suicide based on being bullied through some type of electronic means. So there really is, a lot of negative adverse effects on victims with cyberbullying, just like with physical or face-to-face bullying. Effects of bullying: those who actually are the bully showed to experience academic problems, poor psychological adjustment, later delinquency. These are kids that typically have other problems going on. Those who are bullied can experience psychological distress, adjustment problems, anxiety, low self-esteem, depression, in some cases PTSD, and again, self-injurious behavior, including things like cutting and, unfortunately, suicide in some extreme cases. Some of the signs of bullying: comes home with damaged clothing or property, frequently loses books or personal belongings, has unexplained injuries, attempts to avoid school, doesn't want to go to school, so will fake sickness, headaches, stomach aches, doesn't want to visit with friends, has fewer friends than maybe normal or in the past, changes in eating habits and sleeping habits, and those would definitely be signs of depression. Feels helpless, bad about themselves, moody, anxious, or angry, and really just showing fear of going to school, fear of doing activities with friends, fear of, going to school activities. Any of those things can be signs that a child is being bullying. Now, signs that a child may be a bully: becomes violent or gets into fights with others easily, gets sent to the principal's office or has frequent detentions, or you're getting information from the teacher that the child is being aggressive towards others in class, has extra money or belongings that you don't know where they came from, has a tendency to blame others for the behavior, and certainly has friends who are bullies. Remember, we talked about how influential friends are, especially in the middle school and early high school years. So if somebody's hanging out with kids who are bullies, they are more likely to engage in that behavior as well, because they get positive reinforcement from their bully friends when they engage in that type of behavior. Now, another thing to worry about is gang violence in schools. So gangs became, really influential here, or really kind of started here in the United States in the 1820s. So they've been here for a very long time. In the 1920s, we saw 1,300 gangs reported here in the United States. And, in the 1980s and 1990s, we saw a lot of gang problems begin to emerge that included a lot of young people in a lot of big cities like Los Angeles, like New York, like Chicago, for example. Now, they are not limited to big cities today, but they're more likely to take place in big cities. A gang is a self-formed association of peers who have the following characteristics: 3 or more members between the ages of 12 and 24. So we're talking about gang violence in school, gang, with young people. There are definitely gangs that include people that are older than that, but we're talking about gangs involving young people. Most gangs have a name and some sense of identity, symbol, colors, things like that, a degree of permanence and organization, and an elevated level of involvement in delinquent and criminal activity. I can tell you just from my own personal experience as somebody that grew up in Southern California, I saw gang involvement in my high school. They definitely had colors. You probably heard of some of the gangs in the Los Angeles area. Los Angeles County has over 1,400 different gangs. A couple of them are more prevalent than others, but membership exceeds 160,000. 2009 suggested that in 2009, a study from law enforcement suggested that there were 28,000 gangs in Los Angeles with 731,000 gang members. I'm sorry, that's in the United States. 28,000 gangs in the United States with 731,000 gang members. And again, keep in mind that, we tend to focus on the gangs that are in bigger cities, but they happen everywhere. Every state, none of us are immune to having gangs. Factors contributing to gang development: conventional socializing agents such as families and schools. If you grow up in a neighborhood or an area where gangs are prevalent, where they are kind of considered to be an acceptable form of socializing, like there are a lot of neighborhoods in Los Angeles where I grew up where gangs are really kind of part of the neighborhood. And if you don't belong to a gang, you are kind of the odd person out. Adolescents do have, some adolescents have a lot of free time, and they don't have a lot of pro-social activities and roles that they are involved with, and so they join gangs. Other reasons that young people join gangs, by the way, is for protection, for income, because in some neighborhoods that is considered to be the norm for those neighborhoods. So there's a lot of reasons that people join gangs. Young people have a place to congregate, usually well-defined neighborhoods, a sense of belonging, especially those kids who are rejected by some of their more pro-social peers. That might, influence them, or certainly contribute to the temptation to join a gang, because they don't have any conventional friends. They've been rejected by a lot of their more conventional peers, and with gangs, they feel as if they are part of that. Now, there's a lot of different theories in criminology and sociology on why people choose to participate in gang activity or join gangs. So strain theory, remember we talked about Robert Merton's strain theory. So, people that feel that strain of poverty, of social, not being part of mainstream social organizations, they're unable to achieve success in socially defined manners. So they look to achieve success through gang activities. Again, if you grow up in some neighborhoods in this country, that's kind of really the only legitimate as you see, the only means you have of having access to money and all of the things that every other young person wants. So strain theory, social learning theory. Remember, social learning theory is modeling or imitating those around you. So if you grow up in a family or neighborhood where gangs are the norm, or family members are in gangs, you are going to model that behavior. Systems theory, this just looks at family disorganization and the inability of families to meet certain needs. It also looks at other systems like schools and churches and other organizations that don't fill the gap for kids, for belonging, for having protection, for having a connection with other people. Social control theory, remember we talked about that. This is a lack of clear community expectations of behavior. And again, this would apply to some of those neighborhoods that I was talking about where gangs are really the norm. Self-control theory, an inability to control one's own impulses. And so, and this is just somebody that's having problems with behavior, and their behaviors are not accepted by other groups they're in their age bracket, and so they join a gang because they're the activities that they want to participate in, whether it's drugs or alcohol or criminal behavior, it's accepted and it fits into gangs as opposed to some other organizations and some other groups that kids might have around them. Now, I remember I said that, even though we think about, gangs in areas like Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and Atlanta and some of the bigger cities, and they're definitely more prevalent in those areas. If you look up here, this blue line is big cities. So we do see more gang members in larger cities. But if you look in suburban areas, we still have gang prevalence. We have smaller cities, and we even have gangs in rural areas. It's definitely more of a big city issue, but none of us are immune where we live from gang activity. Now, victims of gang violence generally live in or among the perpetrators of their crimes. So gangs are usually violent in their own neighborhoods or close to their own neighborhoods. Often seen as contributors to the crime, frequently afraid or unable to exercise victims' rights. Despite legislation that allows for relocation, prosecutors lack funding for relocating victims and witnesses of gang violence. A lot of people that live in dangerous neighborhoods where gangs are prevalent, the victims are scared to come forward. They're afraid of what's going to happen to them or their family members if they rat out, so to speak, gang members. We often have language barriers that that really kind of get in the way of people coming forward, and victims may be affected by cultural norms and kind of the norms of any given neighborhood. Again, where that type of behavior is accepted, somebody might not want to again rat out because they would be the person that is the outlier, because the vast majority of people in those neighborhoods are gangs. Now, addressing gang violence in schools. There are a lot of anti-violence programs in school, anti-bullying programs in school, and in larger cities where gang issues are problematic in schools, they definitely try to address that in schools. One of the things that I saw in California early on, and we see this all over the United States now, but early on in California, gangs wore specific colors. So one of the things that the California schools did long before other schools was to require school uniforms to make everybody neutral at school. So nobody could wear particular colors or particular types of clothing or particular bandanas that associated them with being in a gang. So that's one thing that schools have done to address gang violence in schools. Programs to strengthen families and parenting skills. We've seen this before. We've talked about this before, trying to identify those who are at risk and helping those families. Again, this is difficult and expensive. Programs that promote and strengthen social and academic competencies, programs that enhance a sense of community, getting these kids to feel like they belong to schools, to teachers, to academic leaders. Engagement of community groups and community leaders. Again, trying to get kids attached to something in their community that is important to them so that they're less likely to want to join gang violence. So these are some of the things that can be done to try to address gang violence in schools. All right. when we talk about school violence, it is not just students who are victims of crime on school property. Teachers often are the on the receiving end of violence as well. So research on teachers in terms of being victims, there's not a lot of research, and we don't. So there's not a lot of attention giving to teachers in terms of being the victims of some type of aggression or violence. In 2007 and 2008, during that academic school year, one survey found that 8% of secondary school teachers, and so that would be middle and high school teachers, had been threatened, and 7% of elementary school teachers had been threatened. In terms of actually being assaulted, 2% of high school teachers had been assaulted, and 6% of elementary school teachers had been assaulted. So it's definitely something that not only affects those students in schools, but teachers can also be the victims of aggressive behavior or threats on school property as well. Okay, so at the top of this lecture, I talked about how we tend to associate school shootings when we think about school violence, and that's definitely something that has become increasingly prevalent, and it's definitely an issue that our entire society really has had to face in the last 10, 15 years. This is a report that was put together by CNN, and this just looks at the last 10 years. So in the last 10 years, we've seen 180 school shootings with 356 victims. And just kind of scrolling down, you can see in 2009, 5 killed, 14 injured. 2010, 4 killed, 7 injured. 2011, 3 killed, 18 injured. 2012, 31 killed, 8 injured. 2013, 6 killed, 11 injured. 2014, 12 killed, 16 injured. 2015, 3 killed, 22 injured. 2016, 5 killed, 46 injured. 2017, 8 killed, 32 injured. 2018, 37 killed, 68 injured. So that's just up until 2018. And when we're talking about school shootings, we're definitely talking about school shootings at K through 12, but there are school shootings that also take place on college campuses, and I'm sure that you're all aware of that. So some of the issues that not only educators but law enforcement officials have had to face, psychologists have had to face, is trying to identify students that are at risk for lethal violence, how to assess the degree of a specific threat that's been made against a school, and whether or not to take those threats seriously, how to manage the aftermath, how to deal with the horrifying events, especially other students, how to help them get through these horrifying events. Now, table 8.5 on page 304 of your textbook, kind of like what I just showed you on the CNN website, has a list of a lot of the more recent school shootings. So you can take a look at that. It talks about the victims, the offender, and how many people were killed and how many people were injured. And when you look at that, you'll see that it's all over the United States. And if we look at all school shootings, they're all over the United States. So it's not just one area of the country that's at risk. It's all areas of the country are at risk. So one of the things that school officials and law enforcement agencies have had to do is understand threat and try to determine whether threats of violence are credible or not, and do they need to take action with these threats. So a threat is an expression of intent to do harm or act out violently against someone or something. Threats can be spoken, written, symbolic. They can be on school property, in bathrooms. They can be in letter forms. They can be things that students tell other people. Also today we have social media. So threats that are posted on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. Those are things that law enforcement officials and school officials have to look at as well. Threats can be classified into 4 types: direct threats, indirect threats, veiled threats, or conditional threats. Direct threats identifies a specific act against a specific target. So these are delivered in a straightforward manner. I am going to place a bomb in the school's gym would be an example of a direct threat. An indirect threat tends to be vague, unclear, and ambiguous. Um, Plan, intended victim, motivation, and other aspects of the threat are masked or just hard to understand if they are, or what the actual specific target is. If I wanted to, I could kill everybody at this school would be an example. Veiled threat strongly implies that there is some type of threat, but does not explicitly threaten violence. Example, we would all be better off without you around anymore. And a conditional threat, often seen in kind of extortion cases. If you don't pay me $1 million, I will place a bomb in the school. So those are examples of the different types of threat. The vast majority of threats against school are direct or indirect threats. And again, it's really difficult for law enforcement agencies and school officials to determine whether or not a threat is credible and if they need to take action by evacuating the school, by closing down the school, things like that. I can tell you that my kids, when they were in high school, there were times that there were direct threats against the high school about a bomb being placed in the school is one example that I can think about. And my kids text me from outside the school. The school was evacuated. The police were brought in, dogs were brought in, and the entire school was, they did a sweep of the entire school before they let students back in. So schools with all of the violence that we've seen, like we just saw on that CNN page, or if you look on page 3 or 4 at that table 8.5, with all of the violence that we've seen with school shootings and other threats towards school, most schools have to take these threats seriously. A four-pronged assessment model, which was developed by the FBI, was really designed to help law enforcement agencies and school officials and psychologists, by the way, determine whether or not a threat is credible. So this particular four-pronged assessment model, threat assessment requires specialized training and generally consists of 4 elements. So this is training teachers, administrators, working with law enforcement agencies to determine if a threat is credible. Personality dynamics, means of managing stress and conflicts, expression of anger, resiliency, response to authority, the need for control, the ability to empathize with others. Looking at family dynamics encompasses both role modeling in the family and the ability of the family to provide a supportive environment. School dynamics includes the culture, rules, and roles of responsibility of schools, and social dynamics involves issues related to larger society. So these are the things that school officials and really communities in general can look at to not only determine if threats are credible, but also to help reduce the number of violent acts that are done against schools. I can tell you that when there is a school shooting, forensic psychologists are doing research in those areas. If the shooter lives through the incident, which often they don't, but if they do, they would definitely do evaluation of that person. Even if they don't live, they do an evaluation, really a case study is what they do on school shooters, mass shooters as well, but we're talking, and these are often mass shooters. But what they're looking for is trying to determine, are there red flags that they missed, which can help us going forward to identify those red flags and help those students before they engage in violence. So some of the red flags that they have found, there is no like typology of a school shooter, but they have found a lot of the school shooters have been bullied. So they've been the victims of bullying. A lot of them, the vast majority, have had some type of mental health issue in the past. Most of them have had at least some type of contact with the criminal justice system, and most have access to weapons in the home. So those are some of the things that they have found that seem to kind of be a theme running through school shooters. And again, those might be red flags that we need to kind of keep looking at in the future. The effects of school shooting, really, our schools have changed a lot in the past 15 years. We have increased security measures. A lot of bigger schools, particularly high schools, now have metal detectors. Depends on how much of a budget school officials have. They also have increased security staff, direct communication with community members, with parents. So, kind of an emergency communication system where they either email or send out texts to students and family members of a threat. This is particularly prevalent on college campuses because students are really kind of all over the place in terms of where they live and where they might be. So they'll send out emergency communications through text messages and emails, allowing security staff and others to carry concealed weapons on campus, and an overall sense of fear, not in all communities, but some communities that are kind of in areas that we have just kind of general higher crime rates. We have more fear on those campuses. All right, so super important chapter in terms of the different types of victimization that students and young people can experience. Let me know if you have any questions about anything in this chapter. Otherwise, have a great